The title refers to the overriding message of this book, that financial success is not a hard science, it's a soft skill, where how you behave is more important than what you know. Morgan makes this point with fascinating, interesting short stories. The really insightful point that Morgan makes is that we teach finance as if it's like physics, where there are fixed rules and laws. And sure, that is part of it. But really, we could learn a lot if we were to teach money like it's psychology, where emotion and nuance are big drivers of what happens. The prime example of this is the contrasting story of Ronald Reed and Richard Fuscone. Ronald Reed was a humble man who lived in rural Vermont. He worked for over 20 years as a gas station attendant and mechanic. He then worked as a part-time janitor for 17 years until he was 76. Ronald died in 2014 at 92 years old. When he passed, he had a net worth of over $8 million. He left $2 million to his stepkids and over $6 million to his local hospital and library. He made international headlines when he died. He'd made a huge fortune over his lifetime, despite never having a large income. It wasn't as if he inherited a bunch of money or won the lottery. He worked relatively low-paying jobs, saved what he could, and invested it in blue-chip stocks. He did that for decades, and his net worth grew to over $8 million. At around the same time that Ronald died, a man named Richard Fuscone was having his home foreclosed at auction for 75% less than what insurers estimated it to be worth. Richard went to Harvard. He was an executive at Merrill Lynch. He had an MBA. He'd done so well that he retired in his 40s to do philanthropy. But in the mid-2000s, he borrowed a lot of money, and he did that to expand his stunning home. This home had 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 2 pools, 7 garages, and cost over $90,000 a month to maintain. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, he was caught with a lot of debt and assets that were falling rapidly in value. It's this juxtaposition between Ronald Reed and Richard Fuscone that drives home the point that Morgan, the author, is trying to make. On paper, Richard Fuscone had all of the technical knowledge on finance that one could ask for. He had a huge salary. He went to Harvard. By contrast, Ronald Reed had none of those things. No college degree, no high-paying job, no experience in the finance industry. Yet Ronald outperformed Richard in the field of finance by an order of magnitude. In what other field can someone with no training, no degree, no experience, none of that stuff, outperform someone with the best education, the best training, the best position? Training and education help, but ultimately what's really important when it comes to money are those soft skills. It's how you behave. That's something that makes the finance industry unique. It's unlikely that Ronald could have outperformed a heart surgeon at his job, or a nuclear engineer at her job, or an architect at his job. But he was able to outperform a financier at his because what really counts is how you behave, not what you know. One of the behaviors that served Ronald really well, and that the author comes back to repeatedly throughout the book, is the habit or the behavior of saving. It's not as sexy as having a market-beating portfolio or picking the next tech stock winner, but it is hugely important. A great point that Morgan makes that I had not really thought of before is that sometimes investors may work tens of hours a week to add 0.1% to their returns. But they could easily achieve the same outcome if they addressed maybe 2 or 3 percentage points of lifestyle bloat in their finances. That lifestyle bloat can be exploited with a lot less effort than what it takes to consistently beat the market by, say, 2 to 3% a year. Also, comfortably living below what you can afford removes so much of the social pressure that we sometimes subject ourselves to. That's not to say that you should live like a pauper, but getting your savings rate as high as you can makes such a difference over the long term. And ultimately, saving is about taking back your time in the future that you'd otherwise have to spend working to pay the bills. Like so many other books on finance, Morgan talks about the benefits of dollar cost averaging into index funds consistently over a long period of time. But the way he argues for doing so is unique. At this point, it's well established that active investors underperform passive benchmarks over time. 85% of large-cap active managers did not beat the S&P 500 over the decade ending 2019. And that's a figure that's been pretty stable over history. The other thing, though, is if you'll have a high chance of meeting all your financial goals by indexing without having to take the extra risk that comes from trying to outperform the market, then what's the point of even trying? One of the reasons why active investors underperform passive investors is that tails drive everything in finance. By tails, we mean extreme events. This is one of my favorite ideas from the book. It's an idea that most of us understand when we think about investing in startups. The vast majority of startups fail, some do okay, and a handful deliver massive returns. But surprisingly, this is also true for publicly listed stocks. JP Morgan published a study looking at the returns for the Russell 3000 index from 1980 to 2014. The Russell 3000 is kind of like the S&P 500, but instead of tracking the 500 biggest stocks in the US, it tracks the biggest 3,000 stocks. The idea is that it's representative of the entire US stock market. Well, from 1980 to 2014, 40% of all Russell 3000 stocks lost at least 70% of their value and never recovered. Basically, all of the index's returns came from 7% of the stocks in the index. This small group of stocks outperformed everything else by a huge margin. This is a concept that's not easy to grasp. But in finance and business, tails drive everything. The other argument for dollar cost averaging into index funds consistently over time is a chart that Morgan humorously refers to as "shut up and wait." It's just one page with a long-term chart of economic growth. Here it is. Really, good investing is not necessarily about earning the highest returns. It's about earning pretty good returns for a long period of time. That's when compounding runs wild. The final idea from the book that I felt was worth highlighting is that you should not over-rely on history because really, history is the study of surprising events. Not only that, things change over time. In investing, we often like to rely on history for comfort, that our assumptions are reasonable. But if you do that, you're using past surprises as a guide to future boundaries. Also, the world of finance and business continuously changes. Venture capital barely existed 25 years ago. The S&P 500 did not include financial stocks until 1976. Technology stocks barely existed 50 years ago. Things are continuously changing. Take Benjamin Graham's classic book, The Intelligent Investor. The book contains some formulas for picking stocks. Those formulas were relevant when he wrote the book, but they are just not relevant at all for today's world. For example, he recommended conservative investors avoid stocks trading for more than 1.5 times book value. That just is not applicable to today's world. That doesn't mean we should ignore history when thinking about money, but the further back you look, the more general your takeaway should be.